As promised, here is our coverage of the first clash between Vishwanathan Anand and Magnus Carlsen. This was in 2004 and Magnus was 14 years old. So Vishwanathan Anand at the peak of his career, at the peak of his form, winning tournaments after tournaments, facing the Norwegian prodigy, the chess prodigy, the Morphe of chess, Magnus Carlsen, who at this point was already a grandmaster and a fierce one at that. He was exceptionally strong at this point, and he was mostly known as a tactical genius. And in this game, Vishy realized that his weakness lied in the end game, and he took Magnus into an end game and crushed him. He taught him a lesson, and as we'll see, Magnus went on to become perhaps one of the greatest endgame player of all times. We have seen so many examples of Magnus's games where he just crushes his opponent completely in the end game. So this was the time when he was young, and this is some important lessons that he learned from Vishy. So we're gonna skip the opening pretty much because that's not what we do on our channel. We focus on the end game. So this was a Petrov, and we go into the main line. And Vishy plays knight to c3. Vishy was white here, and Magnus was black. So they go into this line, very popular one. And basically, white gets so many open squares for his pieces, whereas black, exchanges one pair of his knight, a pair of his pawns, and basically says that he's super solid, he has no weakness in his structure, and the game can easily become very, very equalish because black is completely solid. So white plays bishop f4, developing a piece, and probably in this kind of openings, white castles on the queen side, and trying to attack on the king side ferociously. So castles by Magnus, we have queen to d2, preparing to castle long, knight to d7, long castles, knight to c5. Here we have h4. So you can see already Vishy is starting to put pressure on his young opponent. Black played bishop to g4, and this is something, now it's getting interesting. So let's see what happens next. h5, this was a novelty at the time, and Magnus now started to spend some time. Remember, this was a time when Vishy was at the peak of his form, and he used to smash out his moves one after the other. He used to finish games sometimes in within minutes, like less than half an hour. He used to finish classical games within less than half an hour. He was just exceptionally uh, powerful player when it comes to speed chess. And Magnus, as we know today, is similar, but at this point he was very young and inexperienced in a way. So playing against world champions, so obviously it's a lot of pressure. So after h5, black played rook to e8, and what are the weakness of this move? Well, you have problems on the f7 square. You're moving a piece away from a king, which means that there can be some issues. So white just played bishop to c4. Just looking at the f7 point, just looking at it, and maybe in the future we can have something. So c6 played. This was a brave move by Carlsen. Basically, he's given up a pawn on d6 in order to damage white's structure. So let's see what happens. This is a dare. Does Vishy take the dare? Yes, he does. He takes the pawn. He accepts the challenge. And after this, basically the idea was black. White will have a extra pawn. As you can see, white have one extra pawn. But the problem is the extra pawn that white has is not very healthy. The pawn structure is extremely damaged. So making use of the extra pawn here is very, very tricky and very difficult. And Magnus already pointed out the problem. He plays rook to d8, you know, saying to Vishy that, okay, we're going to exchange one pair of rooks, and you have to still prove that you're still better here because it's very difficult. Black, you can see, is much better as if we consider the pawn structure. He has two pawn islands, completely compact, and zero weaknesses in his pawn structure, whereas white has three pawn islands with tremendous amount of weaknesses. So converting this extra pawn into a win is exceptionally difficult. But can the world champion Vishy do it? I mean, at the time he was world champion, so that's the reason I'm referring to him as world champion. So here he played an excellent move. Here he plays rook to d4. Again, this is something that Magnus would play nowadays. Just trying to get the most out of the position, just squeezing the best and maximizing your advantage. Exchanging rooks on d8 doesn't give white anything. I mean, black just takes, and there's not much. The lesser number of pieces, the difficult it gets to attack your opponent, and that's the reason rook to d4 was played. That idea is very obvious. If you take, then I'm gonna capture back, and now you can see my pawns have been straightened up. I have a pawn majority 4 against 3, and that will definitely be an advantage. So Magnus, avoiding that, played b5, attacking the bishop. And what do we do now as white? If we put back the bishop, then maybe black is okay. But white as Vishy played a very nice move here. So you can try to give yourself a few seconds, try to find the solution, the move. I mean, so Vishy here played rook h to d1, just maximizing his pressure on the position. This is an intermediate. This is a very powerful intermediate move. This is a trademark of Vishy. He plays intermediate move and tries to maximize his advantage in the endgame. So the threat being rook takes on d8, black is basically forced to capture on d4, and after c takes d4, basically white has improved his pawn structure. So you can see Vishy is already converting his advantage into one form into the other. So now he has a structural advantage as well, because 4 against c is something, in endgames. So bishop is attacked, but taking the bishop would be a mistake, because white now simply plays c into d5, and the problem is rook to d6 is coming. We are targeting this pawn. This is a weakness. Also, the pawn on c4 is a weakness. So one of the things that white can do here is just play king d2 followed by king c3 and target this pawn. So these two pawns will be extremely weak, followed by the problem on the back rank. I think this is too much for black to handle, and that's the reason Magnus in this position pushed his knight back and played knight to d7, and Vishy just calmly played bishop to d3. Now he has a very nice pawn structure, a majority on the queen side, which can be extremely dangerous. So now knight to f6 is played. Looking at this pawn, so should we defend or should we go on the offensive? Generally, when you have the advantage, try not to be defensive. Try to be aggressive. So the move that white played here is again is a very powerful move. White plays d5, breaking the pawn structure. In the game, Magnus took the pawn and he basically had this split pawns. Well, what happens if the knight takes? Then we have the simple bishop takes on b5. The c6 pawn is weak. The knight will be attacked. I mean, if pawn takes, then the knight is targeted. This is tremendously bad for black, and that's the reason in the game Magnus took this the pawn on d5 and allowed Vishy to capture on b5. Again, you see a very nice conversion of advantages. White not only has a pawn majority on the queen side right now, but also a big advantage because of weak pawns. These are isolated weak pawns, and basically having weak pawns means, which basically means that one of your piece will have to keep defending that pawn. For example, the knight on f6 is not completely independent. He has to keep an eye on the d5 pawn because that's a crucial pawn. The same can go with the a7 pawn. If you try to attack it, black will have to defend it because that's a very crucial pawn. That's the thing of having weaknesses. When you have weaknesses, your pieces suddenly become weak and they become passive. And one weakness, one bad piece can generally, it's like a flu, it spreads. If you have one bad piece, suddenly one of your other pieces becomes weak, and that's how it spreads. So this pawn on d5 and the pawn on a7 are miserable pieces. They are like cancer in the position, and basically they make black's life very difficult. So how should black play here? Black in the game played rook to e5. This is a generally a good move, I would say. Black is already in trouble, but this is generally a good move because the thing is, in endgames where you have rooks, you need to play actively. Sometimes it's okay to give up pawns, but you need to play actively. That's the concern. But there is some weakness of this pawn, of this move, and the weakness is, here we go. The back rank is left unguarded, and white can play c4, a beautiful move, making use of the back rank. If pawn takes pawn, then we'll have rook to d8. That will basically decide the game because the bishop is also looking at the e8 square, and that's the reason black has to play king to f8. Trying to get out of the cage, and white now pushes forward with c5. Now we have something extremely concrete. We have a passed pawn, which is very powerful, which can be easily protected with other pawns joining in. So this is already difficult. So black in the game played d4, trying to attack the pawn on c5, and white should now just play calmly, and he plays b4. It's very important to keep patience here and just try to hold on your initiative. Do not try to push forward, or do not try to look at forcing variations. Forcing variations are good, but if you have a simple variation, a simple one works, then why look for forcing ones? So b4 being played simply protects the pawn. connects the pawns, and basically it's very difficult game for black already. So black plays a5 trying to split the pawns, but white just plays again simple chess. Just do not think much. If you have a simple position, play like Magnus. Okay, Magnus is on the wrong side this time, but generally Magnus in this position would simply play the same move as Vishy played. He would play a3, and in general, here we have two connected passed pawns. They can easily be protected. So these are two connected, protected passed pawns, extremely powerful. The game is nearly ended because white was Vishwanathan number one at that point, playing against 14-year-old inexperienced player, strong but inexperienced. So black played knight to d5, attacking the pawn on b4, but we simply play rook takes on d4. So here we go, protects the pawn, and now there are no more black can go for normal tricks. The pawn is simply going to promote. So let's see, rook takes pawn, we have c6, and the final move here. Just give yourself a few minutes, try to find the correct solution, correct move for white. So here we go. Yeah, the correct move that white played here is rook takes on d5. This forced black to resign. This forced the 14-year-old Magnus to resign the game, because after rook takes we have c7. This square is guarded, the c8 square is guarded, the c5 square is guarded. The pawn is going to push forward and queen, and the squares are just out of his reach. So the game would simply end after takes. White would simply promote, and this is not much difficult. I mean, it's easy win for white. So this was the first clash between Vishwanathan Anand and Magnus Carlsen, and yeah, and you can see Vishy just found his weakness of his young opponent. He found that just like Elreza is today, Magnus at that point was not so very good at end games. Especially comparing the class of the two players, Magnus was exceptionally brilliant as a tactical player, but not very good at end games. And after this game and after a few other games, Magnus realized that, and he went on to improve his end games. In fact, he became the strongest endgame player. I would call him the strongest endgame player of all times. Even Capablanca and others would not match his greatness. Of course, he's standing on the shoulders of the giants, but still, I would say that Magnus is the greatest endgame player. He just dominates his opponent. But here were some lessons which he learned from Vishy Anand. So, hope you enjoyed this game. Thank you for watching, and do subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, bye.